Hello everyone, can you hear me well? It's great to start this discussion with all of you, and we were all remarking at how lucky we are that this is such a beautiful place. So this is really, I think, a room conducive to a good discussion on what is a session entitled Unleashing the Potential of EU's Green Trade Agenda, Integrating Development as the Missing Part of the Triangle. Over the last 4 years, the greening of the European trade policy has progressed at a very fast speed, which is evidenced by some unilateral measures that have come out and that have been discussed extensively already at some of the panels that have taken place in this public forum. It's the CBAM, there is the EUDR, the Deforestation-Free Products Regulation, there's the Corporate Due Diligence Regulation, there's talk of mirror clauses and pesticides for agriculture, there's the Eco-Design for Sustainable Products Regulation as well. And basically the overall purpose of these measures by the EU is to ensure that trade regimes align to the EU's domestic regime, which in turn is guided by the EU Green Deal, as well as the Fit for 55 implementation package. These sustainability initiatives, however, have received a backlash and negative reactions from some of the EU's trading partners. In particular, developing and least developed countries have centered critique around a couple of different elements of this measure. One is the so-called green protectionism part of it, or regulatory imperialism, given the unilateral nature of some of these measures. There's also critique about the economics and the fact that these measures could constitute a non-tariff barrier for trade with these developing countries. And finally, there is a justice element to this. Why focusing on prioritizing the environment when it goes against perhaps some development priorities, given the fact that most of the climate problems are associated with advanced economies. On September the 7th, there was a letter by a handful of developing countries. It's actually a second letter directed to the Commission, which sought more meaningful dialogue in the context of the EUDR, and also sought for local production processes to be better taken into account. So all of this is background for our panel. There clearly is a problem. On the one hand, environmental measures are urgent. There's no time to lose. As you've all heard in other sessions, we are not on track to meet environmental objectives. And on the other hand, a lot of these environmental measures are creating problems vis-à-vis trade partners and trade relations. That's the context of today's discussion. That's also been the context of a publication by Europe Jacques Delors, where some suggestions have been provided on how the EU could potentially start responding to this. Because responding they must. This is not something that can just be addressed while different groups remain in silos. So I am very excited against this background to introduce everyone in front of you. I'll start with myself. My name is Colette van der Ven, and I am a senior researcher with Europe Jacques Delors, and I also am the founding director of Tulip Consulting. With me on the panel, I'm very pleased to introduce Geneviève Pons. Geneviève, here to my right, she has been in charge of environmental and climate matters in Mr. Jacques Delors' cabinet during his last mandate as president of the European Commission, and since November 2017 has been heading Europe Jacques Delors in Brussels, which is a think tank at the cutting edge of trade and environmental measures. There is Matthew Wilson on our right, who has over 25 years of experience on trade and development and is the ambassador and permanent representative of Barbados to the UN, WTO, and other organizations in Geneva. And I'm leaving out a lot from these very illustrious figures, but then we'll be here for a long time. To my left here, we have with us Hu Lim, who I'm sure doesn't need an introduction in the WTO, but for those of you that are not here around every day, Hu Lim is the Director of Trade and Environment Division at the WTO, and he has been at the WTO, I believe, since 1999. So he really is the person that needs to be in this conversation very prominently to find ways in which we can resolve the current situation. He works a lot, of course, needless to say, on the environment and trade, but also on the TBT agreement in addition, and I'm sure you've seen his face. Then finally, last but not least, we have David Beer with us. And David Beer took up an appointment as Chief Executive Officer of Trademark East Africa in September 2022. And he has over 20 years of international experience in aid for trade, diplomacy, multilaterals, and economic development with a focus on Africa. So a lot of variety to start this discussion. We're going to have our first set of questions, and here we're going to focus on unpacking the development angle in the EU Green Trade Agenda. So Geneviève, I'm going to start with you. Together with Pascal Lamy, you are the brain behind the recently published Europe-Jacques Delors paper, EU Trade and Environment Development as the Missing Side of the Triangle. This paper sets out a new paradigm on how the EU can better address development considerations in its green trade agenda. Could you please explain to us what that paradigm looks like and what your suggestions would be?
Thank you very much, Colette. So first of all, we may be the brain behind it, but I should also pay tribute to your contribution as well as Claudia's contribution. So we are four co-authors of this paper. Actually, we have, with Pascal Lamy, given our respective backgrounds, started very early in the existence of Europe-Jacques Delors to write about greening trade. I was coming from environment. I was formerly the head of the WWF European office, and he was coming from trade. So we have put these two competences, experiences, networks together. But from the start, we had not forgotten development, the necessity to take into account developing countries. In our paper on the CBAM, for instance, we dared say that least developed countries at least should be exempted, which is probably from a legal point of view not very easy to defend, and we did not get success on that. But at least from the beginning, we wanted a special treatment for developing countries, notably least developed ones, but without forgetting a special situation like the small island developing states. So we have taken this into account from the beginning, pleading for a redistribution of at least part of the revenues of the CBAM for developing countries, for them to finance that transition. However, it was not at the center of our series, which was really on greening trade. And we have come a couple of times recently to Geneva, and the last time we had a wonderful dinner, I must say, organized by the EU Embassy with several ambassadors. So it is Chatham House. I cannot tell you who were there and what exactly was said. However, we went out of this dinner with ambassadors coming from all around the world and from developing countries of very different level of development, with the idea that we should really now focus on this triangle, trade, environment, development, because nothing would happen. The greening of trade would not happen, would not be successful if we don't integrate in an adequate, strong manner the development dimension. This is the genesis of what happened. And then it was late April, the dinner was, I would say, in March, and late April we had time to start to put our ideas on paper, which were then developed in the publication that you know. The first point, I think the main point, is the narrative. The narrative, I mean something very, very important, values behind that. Values, it's about historical responsibility. As a person coming from a long career in climate and environment protection, I can tell you one thing which is obvious to me. The historical responsibility for carbon dioxide emissions is stemming from developed world. So this, we must recognize this responsibility. Moreover, we have financial and technical means to repair at least part of the damages that we have caused. I can speak very freely. This is the advantage of being at the head of a think tank. When you are a civil servant, you cannot. Whatever you think, you have to stick to the institution position. So I just speak personally as the head of this think tank, and I strongly believe that we have this historic responsibility and a duty to repair as much as possible the damages we have caused. So this is the starting point. Then we have to address the situation in a very diverse manner, because situations are diverse. The developing world is very diverse. There are emerging countries, there are least developed countries, there are especially vulnerable countries, and so on and so forth. Then we have a diversity of approaches. They can be bilateral, plurilateral, multilateral, of course, and you know, being part of the WTO world, you know a lot about this last category. And then what are a few things about the instruments, what to do, because why, d'accord, you understand, but what to do. So there we have some ideas, notably inspired by the experience of the JETPs. The JETPs are the Just Energy Transition Partnerships. So the idea is really to target the countries which are the most affected by the greening trade measures taken by the EU, and try to help them green their exported production in order to fulfill the three objectives of trade, environment, and development. The example that I like to give is the example of Mozambique, which is producing aluminium, presently from coal, so a very highly carbonated aluminium, and which would have to pay for the CBAM in a short while, unless they can use the hydroelectricity they also produce. But for that, we have to help them bring this hydroelectricity to the place where aluminium is produced. This is the example that helps you understand. Then we have another idea which has, I think, been already commented a lot. To break silos, we need in many places, it's true at EU level and it is true at international level, instances where the three dimensions are discussed, and this is what we call a global triangle forum, which could be probably, and Paul Lim will tell us what he thinks about, it could be an extension of the Committee on Trade and Environment. It could be maybe a merger or a joint venture with the Committee on Trade and Development. It could be a common platform, I don't know. The way it will be done will certainly be a question for specialists living here, working here, but the idea is really a need to break silos, and I must say that this idea has had a lot of success in Brussels, where we are facing the same problem. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you very much for giving a really succinct overview of the main recommendations in the Triangle Paper, as we call it. I am now going to turn to you, Ambassador Wilson. Ambassador Wilson, the small island development countries are recognized to be particularly vulnerable in the green transition, given their high levels of sensitivity, including to the EU's green trade instrument, as a result of capacity constraints, amongst others. How do you see these challenges impact the small island developing states and their ability to participate in and benefit from the greening of international trade?
Thank you, Colette. Listen, I'm going to use my diplomatic immunity and I'm going to break Chatham House rules and say I was at that dinner. And I have to tell you, I was shocked by how few ambassadors around the table recognized the possible negative impact that CBAM and other carbon border measures could have on developing country MSMEs. I kept waiting and waiting, eating my cake, and thinking, okay, somebody is going to raise this, and nobody did. When it was eventually raised, then a series of light bulbs went off, and people realized, okay, we need to look at this issue seriously. So, I mean, Genevieve, I really thank you and the Jacques Delors Institute for kind of insisting that the EU climate change policy must incorporate development in a very intentional way. Because the fact remains that when you have big players like the EU, regional policies eventually become global regulations. So the earlier we get it right, the better it will be for all of us in the long run. So I'm not anti-CBAM, because we desperately need policies to deal with mitigation, to deal with adaptation. The world is burning, the world is flooding, the world is drying out in ways that I don't think any of us would have ever imagined. I'm coming from a small island developing state. When I see what's happening in Morocco, when I see what's happening in Libya, when I see what's even happening in Greece, I mean, it fills us with dread. A matter of not if this will happen in our countries, but when is this going to happen? And we will not be able to withstand some of what the larger countries are able to withstand. Take Dominica, for example, a small island in the Caribbean. They had a hurricane, I think this was about 4 years ago, and in 2 days, they lost 200% of their GDP. In 2 days, wiped out all of their agricultural production. So, I mean, this is existential for us. We're living in fear every single day. So, you know, we have to find ways to move forward on these things. And the reason that we have to is, if you look at the statistics, 2023 is the hottest year on record. I mean, everyone can feel it. The main disruptor of food and food prices and food volatility in 2023 was not the war in Ukraine, it was severe weather. Latin America could lose as much as 16% of its GDP due to effects of climate change this century. And average sea levels, and this is critical for small island developing states, have been rising faster since 1900 than during any time in the last 3,000 years. So this is why addressing climate change is so critical to us, but why addressing it with a development lens is even more critical. So, you know, I very much welcome the EU for its CBAM. I welcome its notification to the WTO. And we understand that it's likely in conformity with WTO rules. And we know that there's going to be a period for the EU to assess what the impact has been, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's great. And we really do welcome a more kind of developmentally friendly construct moving forward. But then I look at the EU website where they're explaining the CBAM, and development isn't mentioned once, you know? And I went through it 3 times, so I thought, well, surely I'm missing this, but not once is development mentioned. So no one is disputing the EU's right and responsibility to do what they're doing, but just be aware that precautionism, which is in a way what CBAM is supposed to do, precautionism in Europe could be pre-devastation in ACP. Huh? Africa could lose as much as $25 billion a year as a direct result of CBAM, if not done properly. And I'm sorry, we cannot put environmental benefits at the expense of livelihoods. We have to look at them in tandem. Because the truth is that, and I'm going to focus here on micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. So the MSMEs in the ACP, they have 3 reactions to CBAM. 1, they don't know anything about it. That's a vast majority. 2, they know about it, but they don't know what to do. And 3, this is a very small sector, they will intend to look for other markets. So for those who don't know anything about it, the impact of new regulations will, at least initially, make their production and their distribution processes much more expensive. It will be devastating. MSMEs will shut down. Whole ecosystems of MSMEs might shut down. That will lead to unemployment, that will lead to poverty, that will lead to more irregular migration. And we know the EU does not want more irregular migration. For those who don't know about it, for those who know about it, but don't know how to approach it, frankly, they're struggling for guidance. They don't know who to approach. Do they go to the policymakers? I'm sorry, I have to tell you that a lot of the policymakers in Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific have a series of priorities which are greater than CBAM. You know, we have debt repayments which are equal to our climate change needs. So there are other more priority issues for us to deal with. Who do they go to? Do they go to TPOs? Do they go to chambers? Do they go to international organizations like ITC or TMEA or UNIDO? And then there are those who know about it and have said, well, you know what? We're going to look for new markets. Good luck. Us here in Geneva, I think sometimes we don't appreciate how absolutely difficult it is and time-consuming it is for small enterprises in developing countries to build economic linkages with lead firms and to actually be able to export into a market like the EU or to become suppliers. It can take years, and it will not be easy for MSMEs in the ACP to pivot to new markets or to new suppliers. It simply will not be. So, I mean, just to conclude, I mean, I applaud the green investment happening all over the world, but frankly, very, very little of it is happening in Africa, in the Caribbean, and the Pacific. And this has to do with a risk profile, which frankly is not very accurate. And I worry that we are again at risk of being on the periphery of the green transition, like we were at the periphery of the industrial revolution, that we are still at the periphery of the digital revolution. So it really takes the responsibility of those who hold the pen, who hold the power, and who hold the purse to start seeing the green transition as not just a climate issue, but also fundamentally a development issue as well. Thanks, Colin.
Great, thank you so much, Ambassador Wilson. I think you've really very nicely set the stage about what's at stake here, pointing at the urgency of climate, but also stressing that, as you said it very beautifully, we cannot put the environment ahead of livelihoods, and I think that is something really critical. That is shared by some of the work done by Jacques Delors as well, and that's something we take forward in this discussion. I will now turn the floor to David Beard. And this goes back to actually something you mentioned, Matthew, in your remarks. There's a recent LSE study that estimates indeed that African countries could lose up to $25 billion US dollars per year as a direct result of the adoption of the EU CBAM, which will start entering into force will start going live next month. How, in your view, can the EU best support African businesses as well as smallholders that might stand to lose from these measures?
Thanks very much, Colette. So the numbers, the potential numbers are large. I think perhaps one qualification, $25 billion, is the upper limit. I think the lower estimations are around a fifth of that. $5 billion is still not nothing. But also this is about the ability of countries to adapt and how quickly they can do so. For the more, I'm speaking for Africa, for more sophisticated economies, there's an opportunity in terms of the intellectual capital and the financial capital to see how they can respond fairly quickly. The challenge for us is the least developed countries, those that are most vulnerable. They have the least ability to make these adaptations, and the consequences on them will be the greatest. I know the report also talks about the unintended consequences of trade flows moving away from Europe to other parts of the world. And Matthew, you've said MSMEs are going to find it very hard to do that. I think you're very right. Some of the larger companies may decide from a financial perspective that they're not so interested anymore, and they'll go in other directions. So I think it's something worth reflecting on. So what do we do with this report? Maybe two reflections to start with. Firstly, market-led solutions are never going to solve environmental and social challenges. You do need market interventions from public institutions. I think that is something that we cannot get away with, even if some of the solutions are very hard to work through. Now, that being the case, the question becomes, how do we do this? And certainly, from our perspective with our client countries in Africa and client companies as well, this isn't just about CBAM. CBAM is just one of, you mentioned CSDDD, deforestation regulations, but also there are regulations and requirements coming from a range of other places as well, from the US, from the UK, etc. And in fact, I was in a panel this morning where we were talking about the lack of harmonization between all of these requirements as well, which is critical. So you have a set of exporting countries that are faced with this forest of new requirements coming down the tracks. What should we do about this? Others have spoken, and I strongly agree that that this needs to be an inclusive and consultative process. Now, even if the development of those regulations cannot be, at least their application and how we respond to them needs to be. And the letter asking for more meaningful dialogue is, I think, is very well placed. Secondly, how commensurate can the support be to the burdens of those regulations, in particular for least developed countries? It is going to be extremely important that those people setting these standards and setting these regulations are showing that they're also equally willing to support their partners, and this is about partnership, to adapt and to address them. Now, to avoid this becoming a wholly EU bashing session, I think Trademark, we've just put together our new strategy, and a big part of that is green trade interventions. Now, some of that is about climate resilient infrastructure, some of it is enabling our clients to respond to many of these regulations, some of it is helping develop greener goods and driving down GHG emissions. The EU is one of the first movers, and I think is right out there ahead of many development partners in understanding this and seeing it and investing in it. And certainly, for example, we're just putting in place a new program with EU funding in Kenya to look at the critical problem of the intermodal shift that is going to be needed to maintain exports out of East Africa into Europe. So what do I mean by that? We've seen the first supermarkets in Europe say that they will proudly no longer accept air-freighted horticulture. Much of the economic boom in the region we work in has come precisely from that. And this is where I like your term precautionism, Matthew. I think there's precautionism not just on a sovereign, on a national, supranational level, but also from the private sector. And the risk of this sort of precautionism is that it happens very, very fast. So CBAM, there's a long transition period, and I think that we need to use that transition period in order to create the positive pressure for that adaptation. The private sector can make a decision overnight, and it is extremely difficult to have the agility required to make those changes. So we're now working to shift 50% of East Africa's horticulture from air freight to sea freight, and thankfully the technology is close to being there. That this is going to be a very achievable goal. But yes, to give the EU credit, I think they're right in the middle of this. And it's perhaps to finish with a point. There is a duty to address the impacts of CBAM, but I think there's a duty to address the broader impacts as well from a developmental perspective, because this is not just a climate change issue. It's a fundamental economic issue that we're dealing with. Thanks.
Thank you very much for also bringing in some concrete examples here and looking at the issue very much in a balanced way as well. It's always, and to emphasize the private sector dimension as well. It's indeed important to have a balanced conversation where we avoid putting ourselves in different boxes and actually try to understand how we can address this trade, environment, development intersection and what the technical options are to do that. So I am now turning to Hu Lim, and we're going to shift a little bit the conversation to look at what the role is that the WTO can play in this regard. And there's some developing countries have or are resisting some attempts to discuss and negotiate disciplines at the WTO that are relevant to green trade for fear of legitimizing green protectionism. So that is something that we've seen over the last couple of years. How do you think this fear can be addressed? And do you see a shift in this, especially, for example, as reflected in the African Group's recent submission entitled Principles Guiding the Development and Implementation of Trade-Related Environmental Measures? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Firstly, of course, thanks to Geneviève and Colette for the invitation to join the discussion. During a coffee break earlier this morning, I bumped into Colette and I asked her, please ask me an easy question. She completely disregarded me, but that's fair enough. That's what moderators do. Now, coming to this vital question, maybe let me start by saying a few things that I'm sure all of you share, which is that I think it's certainly an imperative that we need to green trade. We need to do better. We need to reduce emissions. We need to address the existential climate crisis. I think there's no argument against that. But as you've already heard from the panel, the question becomes the choice of instrument, the way in which it is done, and how does one actually deal with the impacts. Okay. Now, of course, I would like to claim diplomatic immunity, but being a secretariat, that's just taken away from me, so I'm not like Matthew. But still, I'll try to be as direct as possible. The point here, I think, on your question on protectionism is that it's a very loaded word. When we talk about protectionism in WTO, it suggests intent, that there is somehow an intent behind the measure. And I think that's not what we're really talking about right now. We're talking about impact. So irrespective of intent, there may or may not be intent, but irrespective of whether there was or was not intent, there's impact. Again, that I think most people, and this is what the panel seems to be saying, there's impact. So the question becomes, how do you address this impact? And there, of course, there are different instruments that one can look at from a WTO perspective, having early dialogue, having more transparency, having more discussion before the formulation of the measure, adoption of the measure, and so forth. That's one part of the equation, but I don't think it's sufficient. I think we have to look for solutions that are also, in a sense, outside of the WTO, but are linked to the WTO. And here, I would like to try to think about this question and try to come back more to what you said about the African Group paper, was that in my reading of it, a lot of it is about how can you help us to actually manage the green transition? How do we do this? How do we go beyond where we are today and to take advantage of the opportunities that of the clean energy transition is offering, as well as the things that we need to do to make ourselves more resilient. And in there's of course also the need to address the specific impact of measures or trade-related climate measures. Here I would suggest, we talk about EU Green Deals, we talk about other countries' Green Deals and so forth. Maybe the vision should be more about a global Green Deal. It's not so much about my country's Green Deal versus your country's Green Deal. We need a global Green Deal. And how do we achieve that global Green Deal is something I think that is something that we need to think a bit more about. And here I have 5 very broad thoughts. One is a very specific role for trade policy in terms of using trade policy to support countries in their nationally determined contributions, national adaptation plans, and so forth. How do we integrate these tools into what is already in the agenda of the Paris Agreement? In that part of it, there's also the big question of technology. A lot of things that we talk about are going to be technology dependent. And the question here is how to use the trading system again and trade tools to scale up trade technologies or breakthrough technologies for that matter, and to do this in a fashion that supports a just transition. I think in the main, from what I've heard of debates here at WTO, countries do want to embrace renewable energy. They do want to move towards solar, they want to move towards wind turbines, they want to make use of green hydrogen and so forth. But they also want to be producers of these technologies. They also want to supply the value chains. So for them, the proposition that they would only be importing such technologies is not is not good enough. I mean, they do need to import, everyone needs to import, but they also have to be part of the value chain. So to move away from the notion of protectionism or my Green Deal versus your Green Deal, it would have to be some sort of global Green Deal where everyone can participate in what will become the new global climate economy. So that is a big technology part. Then there's another part which is not very WTO, but it's about skills, and it's about skills development. You could argue there's a WTO part through services or trade in services, but I think it's broader than that. It's about how do you enable, and Matthew spoke about small and medium-sized enterprises, I think David did as well, about the whole skills part of this new development. And here it's about leveraging trade to support skills development, technology development, and so forth. And then the other aspects which I think are just obvious perhaps, which is that you can't do this without investment and finance. And Matthew already spoke a bit about this, about the financial aspects. And that has to be recognized. There needs to be investment, there needs to be finance. And the question today, we have investment facilitation tools, investment facilitation for development, for instance. Let's think a bit more about climate finance, investment, and trade, and what sort of package can come out of this. So these are all sorts of policies, I think, that would help reduce, maybe not completely alleviate, but it would reduce fears of so-called green protectionism. It would also show that there's engagement to try to lift everyone up into what is this, will be a very needed response to climate change. So these are just a few thoughts. And then the last one just to mention is that some opportunities are emerging for also making better linkages. As we talk about climate issues here at WTO, we also have now a possibility at COPs in the climate change arena, and COP28 specifically, because the UAE presidency has announced Trade Day, which will be integrated into Finance Day within the COP28. It's a presidency program, it's not a negotiation agenda, but it's still a very important point. And the WTO with UNCTAD, ITC, ICC and other partners are helping the UAE to develop that discussion on trade. So I think that would be another linkage. I think it's a bit of a linkage that Genevieve was talking already about in terms of the triangle of trying to bring that sort of discussion into play. So perhaps didn't fully answer your question, but it was a tough one. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. This was a very rich response, way beyond my question, but much more useful than had you stuck to the question. So I think the term of a global Green Deal is very catchy indeed, and not something that I've heard before, and that could be perhaps another way to really start thinking beyond the confines of every country's national interest, which is what's currently driving the bus on climate, at least. So I think that is really, really interesting, as well as some of the other elements that you've mentioned. It seems like we've covered amongst the four speakers already so many elements that are critical to making this really a just, well, I wouldn't say transition, but a triangular approach to trade development and environment, from tech transfer to silos, to financing and debt, to prioritization, to industrial policy. And that's, I think, all very, very rich. We have another round of questions, which we're going to keep very brief. But I think what I would like to do, and this is up to the panelists on deciding, you can either answer the question I prepared for you in advance, or you can say if there were one more immediate action item that you think needs to be done in order for these aspirations to really become reality, what would that be? And I think that could be really useful so that we can go beyond identifying the problems and discussing it towards really perhaps finding ways to make this reality as we all go back to our respective engagements after the public forum. So Geneviève, the floor is yours.
Okay, you take me by surprise, but I will try to be up to your question. Well, something that would make a difference. I think that many things have been mentioned. And I am also grateful to the people who have indicated, and this is notably the case for David, that the EU on the ground is already doing important things to try to facilitate the adaptation of developing countries to the greening trade, notably greening production constraint. Now, I would like to mention maybe two very important points. First, the necessity, which has been already mentioned many times, of transparency and dialogue. With the CBAM, we have actually a long adaptation period because for the time being, the CBAM does not have to be paid. It's only a process which is being put in place, apparently already rather heavy because there are declarations to be made, which is not easy for everybody, and notably if they intervene in these sectors for small orders. Taking what is important is to take opportunity of this adapting period to find practical solution on the ground. There is another example, which is even more striking. You have for the deforestation regulation, anti-deforestation regulation, the real entry into force will start end of December 2024, let's say the beginning of 2025, which means that meanwhile we can really discuss with countries, interested countries, on the way forward. And this is there is a letter for them, from them, I think a very recent one from the 7th of September, 17 nations which are exporting products which are under the competence of this legislation, and which have requested an active dialogue with the European institutions, especially the Commission, in order to have their request and specific situation taken into consideration. So this is about dialogue and adaptation. And finally, finance. We will have to be very innovative as far as finance is concerned. And your country it has been already very, I would say, very inventive on that, and has proposed in COP27 a diverse pathway. And Barbados is one of the two countries which are benefiting from debt nature swap from the Inter-American Bank of Development. And it's about protecting your corals, and in exchange of this protection of common good, the debt are effacé. Erased. So this is one of, I would say that this is one of the very interesting ways forward as far as financing is concerned, because a lot of developing countries have a high ratio of debt. A lot of them receive less money, fresh money for climate adaptation than what they have to disburse for the payment of their debts. And so there are now some inventions that are coming on the market, if I may say so, and that could benefit a lot of countries, notably in Africa, because they have a lot of natural resources that could be used for that. So in this package and in the development part of the triangle, finance can play a very important role.
Thank you very much, Geneviève. Ambassador Wilson?
Thank you. So I have one suggestion, but in 6 parts, right? So
I forgot to say 3 minutes.
So the first, finance again. Invest in aid for sustainable trade. including by ensuring that the Green Climate Fund is replenished in October. So the UK just gave, I think, the highest amount it's ever given. We need other developing partners to step up. We also need them to honor the existing commitments, loss and damage, and also support the Bridgetown Initiative, which you just alluded to, which is an initiative coming from Barbados, which essentially says, reform the multilateral development banks to make them more fit for purpose for the needs in 2023. Number 2, leverage the EU private sector more to share the burden and the bounty. The EU private sector is absent from any real kind of sustainable development assistance in these areas. Put a voluntary percentage of tax on the profits to be placed in a global fund or to be placed in the existing Green Climate Fund from EU big business. Number 3, after the review period that the CBAM is going to go through, do not close the door to regulatory differentiation and waivers, including for LDCs and for small vulnerable economies. And actually, a sidebar, when you revise the paper, Genevieve, Colette, please also include SIDS as part of the vulnerable countries. 4, as Holiam said, invest in discussions at the WTO, but a very particular area. Invest in discussions that consider how small countries, LDCs, SPEs, small islands, can use subsidies and incentives to help their MSMEs meet the new green requirements and invest in greener and cleaner production processes, including technology transfer. I am not one of those people who think that subsidies is automatically a bad word. They have a role in helping to build a circular economy, and the WTO has got to update their rule book for 2023 needs instead of 1994 needs. 5, and this kind of goes a little bit to what David said, the EU, I think, should better use their EU missions in countries as outreach, to build capacity to MSMEs, to partner with local entities, and to use the embassies as more of a feedback loop in terms of exactly what the concerns are going to be. I think if they had done that a little bit better initially, maybe we might not be having this discussion today. And then 6, and finally, support initiatives like the Blue-Green Bank, which was just opened in Barbados, which is to focus on financing for sustainability initiatives. As Genevieve was saying, debt for nature swaps, which essentially restructures sovereign debt for investment and conservation. And one example is Gabon, which I know is going through its own particular issues right now. But the fact is that a few months ago they had a debt conservation for ocean conservation, and I think that's something that could be piloted elsewhere and scaled up. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that really very detailed list of action items. We can all get started immediately. I am turning the floor to David, please. What are your suggestions for immediate action?
Thanks, Colette. If I can turn in a slightly different direction, one issue, one suggestion. Often when we talk about the nexus of trade and climate change, we're pretty much always talking about the need for exporters in developing countries to adapt to the needs or the requirements of developed countries. But we often don't talk about, for example, African countries' own climate needs and their own resilience needs and how trade and trade facilitation can respond to that, which is a very different question. And my suggestion is around a change in framing and a change in attitude from development partners. So, for example, let's take a case study of the drought in Horn of Africa, North Kenya, Ethiopia, Somalia. We've now got 8 to 10 years of failed rains. You have a major, long-running, complex humanitarian emergency. Humanitarian funds are coming in by the billions over 10 years, and yet we're not looking at the fundamental issues behind this, which is often about food trade. So, for example, East Africa is largely self-sufficient in food. Uganda and Tanzania, most years, are net exporters, have a net surplus. And yet there is very little attention being paid to how we can reduce the scale of that problem and reduce the cost of the response, as well as enhancing the economic benefits for the region by by increasing the efficiency of the food trade. Whether that is, for example, we found that over $100 million a year of Ugandan maize was being left at the border because there wasn't enough aflatoxin testing at the Kenya-Uganda border. The East African reported recently that it cost $200 to get a food truck or a truck full of maize across from Tanzania into Kenya. We need to be de-siloing our development work to look at how we're addressing fundamental climate change challenges of African countries and not just the global requirements and the global needs of others. It's a lot cheaper to do that. I think it's a lot more sustainable, it has a lot more impact. And yes, I think we lack imagination because we focus just on this bit rather than here, and we never make the connections.
Thank you very much, David. I think that's a really, really important point as well, that priorities are reflecting the country's priorities in this conversation of aid and transitioning. So thank you for bringing that up. Finally, William, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe for response to this, look a little bit more inward than what I said in the beginning, and look at WTO and things happening within the WTO. And here, I think one action that I would like to see happen is that members really make proper use of the Committee on Trade and Environment. I mean, that committee has been around for quite some time. It has had lots of issues going up and down, but it is the one committee that you have in the whole structure of the WTO that allows for a discussion of the type that Geneviève, Matthew, Colette, and David has already mentioned, and use that committee, to do all the things that you've talked about, both in terms of, what are the win-win solutions, what are the environmental concerns, how do we address those concerns, what are the possible trade impacts from environmental measures and so forth. There's a huge, long list of a work program within the committee. Hasn't really happened. I mean, that's the honest point. And why hasn't it happened? Lots of distrust, lack of confidence in each other, feelings of what have been mentioned of protectionism, green protectionism, and so forth. That's one part of the dimension. The other part is that it's very challenging for a trade negotiator, I imagine. I've never been one. I know some of you here, of course, have been. But what I hear is that it is very challenging because the trade competence is only so far. So if you're going to use the committee to discuss all of these issues, it needs a lot more expertise. Some delegations can afford that, many cannot. Some are well coordinated at home, some are not so well coordinated. So there's also a strong capacity point to this. And to develop that capacity, not just in Geneva, it's about developing capacity in capitals, but in a very precise and very structured way. And you're really looking at coordination mechanisms in capitals that will allow that type of discussion to happen in the CTE would be one. Now, and then very last to that is that, have to recognize that there are difficult issues and there will be frictions and there will be tough questions and there will be unhappiness. Allow that to happen in the committee rather than to avoid it. I mean, there has been a lot of that, and there's probably good reason for it because one does not want to contaminate, so to speak, other discussions or other things happening. But I think there are opportunities to find some gaps and some niches there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that point. I think that's a really important point as well to highlight, that we shouldn't be afraid of having the difficult conversations and of pointing these out so that we can get to a more optimal outcome. So the floor is now yours. So I already see a couple of hands. I invite all of you to answer questions to the panelists. I guess there is a mic that I can provide. Yeah, I think you were first on the front row, and then we have Anja after that. And I've noted both of you over there. Yeah, after that.
Marcus Fischer, I'm with Ørsted, the global renewable energy company. I actually have two questions. I'll be quick, if that's all right. The first question is to Ambassador Wilson on the CBAM, and you mentioned MSMEs being affected, but to my knowledge, there's 5 goods that CBAM covers, or perhaps 6, which are cement, ammonia, steel, aluminum, and then electricity and hydrogen. And forgive my limited understanding of developing countries or Barbados economic landscape, but isn't it mostly large-scale companies that are in these industries, like steel, cement? And my second question is, I guess to the rest of the panel, perhaps Genevieve, you can answer it most freely, but the Commission President, European Commission President von der Leyen, yesterday announced some measures which go into the direction of the clean transition in Europe needs to be made in Europe, is what she, for example, said, and there was an introduction of a subsidies investigation on the Chinese EV imports. So in Brussels, I guess a lot of thinking is right now about supporting European industry in the green transition. What would be your comments on that? If you had 1 minute with Commission President von der Leyen, what would you tell her about these measures she announced yesterday?
Please go ahead. Maybe Genevieve, would you like to start?
Yeah.
And then we have Ambassador.
Thank you. Well, it happens to me to speak to her or her head of cabinet, and always to say exactly what I think, in order to be useful. I will tell her that she should not forget the need of the rest of the world, and especially developing countries, but actually she does not. Because one of the big projects, if you listen to her speech yesterday carefully, you may not have missed that. She mentioned, for instance, what is done in Namibia for clean hydrogen. And I think that Namibia is only one example, because in this part of Africa, there are strong hydro resources that can be transformed into clean hydrogen. So I know that there are a lot in your area of work. There are a lot of projects that are not taking place in Europe, but elsewhere, and most likely this hydrogen will be sent to Europe, which needs hydrogen. And now for the smallholders, I think that the question is more with deforestation than with the CBAM, because actually the products which are presently targeted by the CBAM are coming from heavy industries, and so affecting big companies. But this is different from deforestation. The problematic of smallholders is really with deforestation.
Thank you. 2 comments. Well, if you also listen to the President's statement yesterday, she's appointing an SME, EU SME envoy. And I'm hoping that this EU SME envoy also looks at SME issues outside of the EU borders as well. Listen, let me, I don't know how many of you are from small islands, but if you're sitting on the beach and you see a wave way up in the distance, you better get ready to move, because all it's gonna do is pick up speed, get bigger, and then it's gonna smash against you. So fine, there's 5 products now. May not necessarily be those produced directly by SMEs, but a lot of these SMEs are in the lower value chain of those supply chains. It will expand. The EU is a first mover, which means that the likelihood of this ended up being the global carbon border policy is more likely than not. So you better get prepared. And part of the reason that a lot of developing countries always find themselves in difficult positions is that we often do not prepare early enough when we see these signals.
Thank you. My name is Anta. I work with Trademark, colleague of Dave. I have a question. I'm not sure for who. I think for you. I was in a couple of sessions, and I listened very carefully to some of the companies that were on the sessions. They are the soldiers plowing on in textiles, in coffee. They have to comply day in, day out, and the EU is just one thing. I mean, it's a big thing. But then there's Japan, then there's the US, then there's the UK, then there's like they called it an avalanche of regulations coming towards them. No harmonization whatsoever. Different reports. We're in a donor-led organization, so we have to report to all different donors. We know what a nightmare it is. For companies, it's the same. If you're a small coffee producer, you have to do certification for 3 different regions. Why would you? So is there a role, is it for the WTO, maybe you find another mechanism where these regulations can be at least harmonized, where the reporting can be harmonized? Because EU might be well ahead, others are following suit. Is there a discussion possible on reporting templates? I don't know. I mean, there probably will, Matthew, I don't think there will be a global deal soon. That would maybe be part of it. Yeah, that was my question.
Should we try? Yeah, I mean, I think one thing some of you may already know is that we do have already some agreements that tries to move countries towards greater alignment and more convergence. And in the specific area you're talking about, it would be technical barriers to trade agreement. It's probably not going to go as deep as where you are suggesting, but it is already about that. It's about that as countries adopt standards and regulations, they should try to, they are actually more than try, they are required to base them on international standards. Now the challenge is that in many of these areas, there is no international standard, or there's no recognized international standard. But nevertheless, that framework is there. And then what that framework then goes on to say is that it was a subsequent decision that there are 6 principles for international standards developers. So recognizing that governments don't necessarily make the standards, there's a whole community of standards developers, that the requirement being that governments should try to, well, in some cases they want to get the governments to adopt these 6 principles so that their international standards makers deal with the challenges that you talk about: coherence, transparency, impartiality, development dimension, and so forth. It's still very much at the principles level. Okay? It's still about getting those principles actually to the ground. Is there a role for WTO in this? I think the best test case we have currently is that we have a quite an active discussion on decarbonization standards for the steel sector. We just had that yesterday. It follows on from a previous discussion that was in June. And it is a bit similar to what you're talking about. It's about the fact that many steel companies are finding a multiplicity of approaches, standards, certifications, verification methods, and so forth. So they've come to the WTO and they've asked if the WTO could convene this type of discussion. So for the moment it's convening, and it's convening the standards makers, it's convening the standards bodies, convening some of the major countries to at least have an agenda to talk through as to what are the problems, what are the challenges, what are they doing today. Hopefully it will go further to possible solutions. So it's a very new dimension for WTO, but it's a very exciting one. It's a different sort of discussion. It's not the typical WTO negotiation. But it seems as though the private sector really appreciates this role of the WTO. So the question is, can it be done for other sectors? You know, you talked about textiles, coffee, and other things. But so we've started with steel, so let's see.
Great. There are 2 questions there in the back. The lady all the way in the back, and then the gentleman up front. And I suggest you just ask both of your questions at the same time, so then the panelists can decide which one they want to respond to.
Thank you very much. My name is Funke Bolujoko, and I'm an SME. I'm a producer of herbal teas. I know this is a diplomatic circle where we are quite careful, but looking at really the objectivity of EU's both sustainability and the green agenda, somehow many of us see it as, although we don't want to mention the word protectionism, as a way of actually keeping a lot of the SMEs, particularly from the global south, out of trading with the EU countries. Am I wrong or am I right? And what can we do? Because maybe a typical example, somebody from one of the African countries wanted a particular certification. He couldn't get it from that particular country where the production takes place, but he got it from a European country for products coming from the global south. So how do we really interpret this? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the gentleman in front.
Yes, many thanks. Xavier Van den Bosch from the European Commission. Actually, I had a question, but I think to Ambassador Wilson, I think you mostly replied it about your main concern about CBAM, and I think you stressed that it would be the expansion. And I remember this analogy you made with this wave coming. So I will not repeat that question, but I take the opportunity to really thank you for your feedback. It's duly noted. I take note of the redoubled efforts we have to make on communicating, notably on what we will do with least developed countries and most vulnerable countries on our website. But I think what is important is what you know is what is in the regulation. It's the review that we'll be conducting in 25. The explicit mention that this review should cover the impact on least developed countries, I think is a reflection of the concerns that the EU had while adopting the measure. And I think this transitional period that was mentioned will be key. We have time to learn from this transitional phase. And we will see, you mentioned the three categories of typical exporter. I think by and large, most companies in the world do not fit into this category. In the steel sector, there's mainly big players, but we need to learn more from what is difficult to capture. The smallest, it could be very small importers. And I think we will learn from the reporting phase, however difficult it is, and that will feed usefully the review. So we take note, and I also take note of that we need to focus targeted investment, also using the feedback from our EU delegations. This is certainly something that can be done. I think the example of Mozambique, which is sort of outlier at the least developed countries that is particularly affected by CBAM as it is now, current what it is a very good example in point. So many thanks. It's very useful to hear.
Thank you. I'm going to see if there's a question in the back. We're just going to take 3 of those questions at the same time. So yeah, over there, the lady in the back. Yeah. Yeah, stand up there, the lady with the hand. Yes.
Thank you so much, Chair, for giving me the floor. And thank you so much, the presenters. My question is on the issue of technology transfer. It is critical if developing countries were to make that shift, and we have been talking about it. My question is there any concrete and specific measures to ensure that technology is flowing? Because I remember way back during the Doha round, there was a working group. I don't know where it stopped, but I think it's important that the WTO, we have those concrete specific measures to allow for technology transfer. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm just going to go around the panel so they can pick and choose what they like to respond to. Matthew, sorry, Ambassador Wilson.
Sometimes there's an angel on your shoulder protecting you and you don't realize, because probably the fact that the EU is sitting right in front of my friend, or the SME, based on the question she asked, might make my response a bit more diplomatic. So, let me be honest, as I was walking in here,
Sorry, I was actually going to mix it up just slightly. David?
Just a very quick point in answer to you, Femke. As Trademark, we're a trade facilitation organisation, so we look at the practicalities. I think the question is more, how do we make it easier for SMEs to hit the standards, for national institutions to verify them, and for the mutual recognition to happen. And there's a lot of work that's ongoing around that, and there's a lot of institutions really committed to that. There's a gap in where we are and where we want to be, but a lot of us are committed to closing that gap. So I don't think we're going in the wrong direction. I think as Matthew said, sometimes these regulations create these gaps, and then we need to work as quickly as we can to fill them.
I think Matthew really answered the technology transfer question. All I could add to that is to say that I think I agree that this is a vital part of the equation. And what I was thinking of was that we have to look at technology in all its facets. So, and that means in terms of trade policy, also thinking about, we haven't talked much about this today, trade in services, for instance, and the other part being digitalization and digital economy and e-commerce would be another sort of part of this equation. The only thing I would add to what Matthew said, getting the working group and technology transfer to be doing more and really having real discussions, would be you could have technology discussions in other parts of the house as well. It doesn't have to be just in that working group. So it'll be a question of how does one broaden out this discussion of technology transfer and not make it just the effort of one working group would be one small suggestion I would have. Then the other one I was thinking would be that, to put a more positive, aspect to a lot of what we're talking about, many countries, developing countries, actually already have quite a lot of climate competitiveness. The challenge is to realize it. There's one panel I was listening to, and they were talking about hydrogen, for instance. I think you all have probably been listening to many of different things. And it was telling us that from the private sector's perspective, it makes a lot of sense to them to go into a developing country, generate clean energy in that developing country, to then generate green hydrogen, and then export the green hydrogen out again, because for the simple fact there's a lot more sunlight in developing countries than in many other countries. So it's actually climate competitive for them to do that type of investment and technology transfer. Then they were saying what's preventing them is partly policy certainty, policy frameworks, and how can they ensure that if they're going to invest into a country that they will get the return that they're expecting. Now, I think those sorts of very concrete issues may be things that maybe go beyond the WTO, but they might be worth looking into. Thank you.
Thank you. And just to wrap things up, we have Geneviève.
Thank you very much. It was a very rich discussion. I have to thank very much the participant to the panel, but also the audience. And I must say that the question which had been asked concerning standard and SMEs or technology transfer are absolutely key. And maybe very, very shortly, as far as the question on standards is concerned, of course, the intention of the EU legislator is certainly not to push SMEs out of the game. However, the answers to their special need careful attention, and I think that it is one of the tasks of Aid for Trade. And also one idea that Matthew has evoked rapidly, we have special regimes for SMEs inside the EU. We could consider the possibility to have such things outside the EU. That's the first point. As far as technology transfer is concerned, I would like to say a word about the ETEP, because the Trade and Environment partnership that we have evoked in our paper are also about technology transfer. and the case of Mozambique that I mentioned would contain technology transfer. So it happens in such a kind of partnership, but also in our paper, and benefiting from the long experience of Pascal Lamy, trying to get some openness on technology transfer, there is a suggestion for a technology transfer bank that would help solve many of the problems that are, that impede this technology transfer. But you see, we could endlessly speak about that, and what is extremely important, I see that there is a consensus that the three dimensions are now really linked. And I hope, Pauline, that you will be able to give to the CTE the dimension of a Global Triangle Forum.
I think you need to make Matthew the chair of the CTE.
Yes, exactly. Thank you so much to everyone, to the panelists, to your participation, to staying all the way to the end, and for your really great questions. My very brief takeaway is one, be pragmatic. Let's not look at it, intent or not, what's the impact, what can you do as a country, how can you ensure, like you were saying, David, that this is connected to your, and you as well, Matthew, your developing countries' national interest, your priorities, and how that can all be connected. The second is, as I think also Pascal Lamy and you, Geneviève, would say, walk the talk, right? So if tech transfer matters, if debt forgiveness matters, show up in these meetings. Someone said once, I think it was Woody Allen, 80% of life is showing up. Go to the meetings. And then I think, finally, it would be to dream big, right? The Global Green Deal, I think, is a concept that we can all take with us as we consider how we can do this in a less fragmented way, so we can reach common problems by a much more homogeneous approach than we have right now. Thank you so much. Session. Oh, wow. That's great. Yes, you guys are so great. Yes, amazing job. I like your analogies, Matthew. The wave and the beach. I mean, look, we all need to go to Barbados.
Yeah, great discussion. I love the questions as well.
Oui, ça,
That he has, yes. Yes. Nice to meet you.
Mais cette idée de Global Green Deal, elle est formidable.
c'est Global Green Deal.